So today what we're going to do is we're going to begin to discuss what real GDP is. We're going to define nominal GDP. We're going to look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and then I'm going to show you a link to where the Producer Price Index is. So when we're looking at nominal GDP, we're seeing the prices of the goods and services in the market. So it's not adjusted for inflation yet. So how would we adjust for inflation to see what GDP is in real terms? So when we do this, we start out with looking at what the nominal GDP would be for a particular year. Now, so we're going to look at 2006. So here we have the values for 2006. This is measured in billions of dollars. So we saw that in 2006, the U.S. had $13.247 trillion of final goods and services that they produced domestically. Now for that particular year, I observed a price index for GDP, or also known as a GDP deflator, of 116. Now what this means is that there was a 16% increase in prices during that time period. So if I'm wanting to find real GDP, I've got to adjust for this 16% increase. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the nominal GDP, the 13.247, I'm going to divide it by 116, and then I'm going to multiply by 100. So what I find is that in real terms, the real GDP for that particular year was $11.42 trillion. So let's say that I was interested in how much GDP had increased over those 6 years. Let's say that I wanted to know what kind of growth I had for my economy. If I look in nominal terms, I find that the increase is 13.9%. But you'll recall that from the previous slide, I told you that prices had increased by 16%. So I'm going to want to compare these two values, this real GDP to real GDP during that time period. Now you may be asking right now, well, why is the real GDP the same as the nominal for 2000? Because 2000 is our base year, so I'm comparing it to that year. So what I find there is that the increase actually is only about 16.3%. So I can see more in real terms how the economy grew. So what this is telling me is that over this 6-year period, the growth that I experienced was about 16%. Now the CPI is something that's calculated monthly, and I look at a market basket of goods and services. So it's a pretty broad basket. I may have milk in there and bread and other things. And this is reported, and I see the changes from month to month, how it changes. Now let's just say, for example, that I had looked at these different indexes, and what I wanted to know what the inflation would have been from last year to this year. So let's assume that this year's CPI was 220. And last year's was 200. So essentially what I'm doing here is, if you remember from your math classes, I'm doing just a percent change. I'm looking at the new minus the old compared to the old. Make that area a little more defined. I'm going to multiply it by 100 because this is percent term, and I want to know how much it changed by. Now for this particular year, what I found is that there was pretty high inflation. It was about 10%. Now this is significant because I may want to know, well, how much has prices changed by? Well, as a consumer, I want to take into account that I've got an increase at 10%, so maybe I should budget for that. Now at this following website, what you'll find is there's a list of what's known as the PPI index, or the producer price index. This index is watched because it kind of gives an indication of what the prices in the stores are going to do. The producer price index looks at what producers are paying for their goods. How much is it going up? And what we've seen is that it's starting to increase, which may indicate that prices may start rising. We do see some problems with the CPI. We see a few biased. We see some things that overstate inflation actually. One is quality biased, where we see if I'm going to pay a higher price for something, it may be because it's better quality. It ignores the substitution effect of that I can buy a generic instead of Pepsi or Coke. It ignores what discount stores do, and the products that are measured in CPI are often only widely used products. So if a small number of people are using the product, it doesn't make it into these basket of goods and services. So this is an introduction to what real terms mean.